Okay, so since we're not able to go out and see shows and review them ourselves at the moment, I thought instead of doing nothing or writing about the way we are able to do nothing, I thought instead I would pretend I'm going out to see shows and review those. It gives us a great opportunity to draw attention to historical Australian work and to put a little more Australian content into our programming diet. The first of those shows I'm going to review is Quiet Night by Dorothy Blewett. I don't know where that's... I don't know where you can see that. That's fine. Quiet Night was produced in March in 1941 at the Little Theatre in South Yarra. It was a small community theatre where an amateur company called the Dramatists Club of Australia worked out of, and they were there for, I want to say, around 15 years. They produced contemporary new works. They produced classics as well. They were a local amateur theatre company. They were on the site. They were eventually torn down. The building was eventually torn down and replaced by the new Little Theatre, a 400-seat venue, which is still there now as St Martin's. They produced this 10 years into their run. It's by Dorothy Blewett, who was a Northcote girl. She went to MLC. She worked as a teacher and a secretary until her career as a novelist and as a playwright and screenwriter took off. She moved to London in the 1950s and then came back to Melbourne and died in Eltham in 1965 of a heart attack. I guess the trouble with the biographies of people from back then is that they're almost always dead. So generally speaking, it's actually a really good play. There are things to be said about it, things that are about the fact that it is from 1941. That was a different time. There is either work that needs to be done to make a contemporary version of this play producible, or it needs to be presented in context as a kind of museum piece. Given that, it's nothing particularly egregious. There's no overt racism, although there is no characters explicitly of colour, though of course there's no reason why you couldn't cast actors of colour to play any of these roles. It's set in a hospital, in a specialty ward, which is not quite an emergency ward. It might be like a high-intensity ward or high dependency ward. So, and it's in the reception area of that it's staged. So it stays only ever in the one location. All of the things happen in functionally in real time, kind of dramaturgically in real time. We are there for the duration of one night, for the beginning and to the end of one particular shift. It's of course filled with drama, and it's of course filled with action, which is hence the irony of the title, A Quiet Night. And it's that kind of play. It's of that era. It has that kind of sense of humour, the kind of ironic but sort of also slightly archly structured, quippy kind of dialogue. It has some terrific roles for women in it. It is largely filled with and focuses on the women of the nurses of the hospital. Particularly at the time, I would think would have been a rare thing to see so many leading roles for women on the stage in Australia, or much of the Western world, probably. It's set in a Melbourne hospital, I should say. At its best, it's about the procedural stuff that happens in the hospital. So when they're changing over shift and they're just talking about procedural matters, when they're talking to each other as nurses, the layer of sexism sort of strips away and you just see the nurses, which is quite refreshing and really entertaining. The quippiest of the characters, Sinclair, is a joy to kind of watch throughout the entire thing. She's the sort of old hand throughout the work. And then there are two kind of younger nurses, one who seems to be at the beginning of her traineeship, one who is only 5 days from ending her traineeship, both of whom depend on the good graces of the matron of the ward to get their graduation, I suppose. And there is, of course, antipathy between the one who is about to graduate. That's Sister Rankin is about to graduate, has only 5 days to get through to have done her traineeship. And she has convinced herself that the matron has it in for her, is looking for reasons to not recommend her to go forward to being a nurse. I don't know what the training procedures are, and I certainly don't know what they were for 1941. She's in a relationship with a doctor in the... it gets very soap opera-y is my thing, right? Like the stuff where they're just being nurses, where they're attempting to save the life of a patient, or even when they're just engaged in their kind of professional... bickering and stuff. That stuff's all great. The engine of the drama of this thing, unfortunately, is more anchored in, is anchored in relationship drama. And while that's not terrible, it's handled in a fairly hammy, and a way we would, I think, contemporary audiences would feel is a bit melodramatic. The sections where the slightly older couple, Sister Rankin and Dr. Clayton, are having their affair very heightened, especially by the fact that his wife, from whom he is getting a divorce, but it still hasn't come through, is in the hospital because she's mentally unbalanced. She has a great deal of attachment issues. It's fairly clear. She certainly has issues regarding her perceptions of reality, or at least that's the way the play presents her. She is a little bit a woman in the attic kind of trope for the play, and this play is not without its tropes. Nothing that a good contemporary rewrite wouldn't fix. It's a kind of All Saints. It's a kind of it's like it's a medical drama, right? It's not far off the 1940s version of Grey's Anatomy. And so it does get a bit that way. But again, a deft hand would probably be able to fix that. There is also the younger couple, the younger Nurse Sparrow, or Sister Sparrow, and her fiance, Dr. Angus Macready, over-enthusiastic Scottish doctor, who in the first scene where you meet him strikes me as being awfully creepy and predatory. It's clear that he's intended to be charming, and that this interaction is supposed to be playful, but I think a lot of work needs to be done by the actors to establish their connection between these characters long before they start to interact this way, for us, for a contemporary audience, to not feel a bit like, whoa, dude, back the hell off. Anyway, that resolves itself eventually, especially basically around between Act 1 and 2. There are 3 acts to this thing. But the third act is like 10 pages, so realistically it's just the conclusion to Act 2. It's a slightly longer Act 2. They are about to be married. Matron has a rule, or the hospital has a rule against couples or professionals being involved together. The people who work together being involved together. It's fairly common practice back then. I don't know if it still is. Oh, and Matron catches them having an illicit kiss at the end of Act 1. Sister Rankin steps up to defend her. Sister Rankin refuses to name Sister Sparrow as having being in this relationship, and who that might have been that was caught kissing. The entire thing escalates into an anxiety around who's going to get fired and who's going to confront Matron, and has in its way an inheritance from the kind of contrived romantic plots of the Innamoriti in the Commedia dell'arte. I mean, it's in there if you want to go look for it. Again, there's a lot of kind of I think the sexism of the age is baked into the language of some of the way these things are expressed in the play. But all the professional stuff could basically stay as is. It's a lovely kind of reflection of the era. And of course, you could present it, I imagine, a clever kind of feminist reading of the works as exactly as they are could underline some of those things. I mean, it's ripe for interpretation, is what I'm saying. The real drama of it that's behind it all is, of course, what they do on the ward during the night. The attempt to save the pneumonia case patient's life has real drama to it. Most of that drama happens between Act 2 and Act 3, and you come in and it's already over. And spoilers, the kid dies, and the nurse, Rankin, who has donated her own blood, once again violating one of the policies of the hospital, but this time for the benefit of a patient, is convinced that she's going to get fired, and it resolves itself around the fact that Matron and Sister Rankin resolve their issues. Matron recommends her to be a nurse because she was prepared to sacrifice herself and give her own blood to save the patient, even though the patient died. I mean, there's some ethical dubiousness to some of the decisions that wrap this thing up, but again, it's about a kind of dramaturgy that's built around an entertaining night in the theatre. The whole thing feels like it's written a little to be a kind of audition for radio or film. There's a lot of good stuff in this play, and I didn't have a terrible time reading it either. Like, it was not offensively hard to read. It was not the language is not overly 50s or 40s. The language is not overly dated. It still feels roughly contemporary. It just needs a bit of a brush up of its politics.